right. Well, now
What a crowd. It's fantastic.
Well, now that they've eaten into our time, let's get a move on, Mayor Pete. Thank you so much for being here, for coming from Washington to New York, headed back to Washington after this to be here at the 92nd Street Y and to be here with me. We've gotten to know a lot about you since you and I first sat down in December of 2018, where I look back at the polls, they weren't even polling your name then. And we met, and I interviewed you for my podcast with the Washington Post, Capehart, and we ran it in January, and I look back, and you were at 0%. They were polling you, but you were at 0%. And then March 10th, 2019, the CNN town hall. That night, you were at between, depending on the poll, 0% and 2% in the polls. What was that? Sunday, May 19th, Fox News town hall. You are at 5% in the Quinnipiac poll with 23 people in the race. That's doing really well. 6% in the Morning Consult poll and Fox News. The Real Clear average has you in third place in Iowa. The Fox News poll of New Hampshire voters has you tied for second with Senator Bernie Sanders. So people are getting to know you. They're getting a feel for you. But the person who has taught us the most about you is your husband. So there was what has to be one of my all-time favorite tweets. It is what I call the puppy slide or the dog slide. And it is the one where Chasten is bemoaning the fact that you are, as you see it there, live from the Buttigieg household, where one is on their second phone interview and the other is still trying to find his slippers. Guess which one is Mayor Pete? The second one that gives us more of an idea of who you are is the one that I call the deep sigh. And it is a tweet from @LouisVertel. It was on April 2nd. Pete Buttigieg seems like the guy who opens a board game, reads the entire instruction booklet from front to back, and then calmly re-explains the rules 30 times to everyone drunkenly playing along. To which your husband replies, "This is so deep sigh accurate." Mayor Pete, how old are you?
37.
You're 37 years old, and yet between these two tweets, you act more like someone closer to my age, 51, or older. Were you always this sort of older man in a young man's body?
I guess, yeah. Some of my roommates in college, one of them's here actually, would probably have said that, but I don't know. I don't feel old.
Well, I mean, it's not a matter of feeling old,
yeah.
But you do have this way about you. There was in your book, on page 25, if you have his book, on page 25, you talk about being around the dinner table with your parents, both professors at Notre Dame, right?
Yeah.
At Notre Dame. And on page 25, you were talking about when your parents would have people over, and you would hear the conversations. And you write, "The more I heard these aging professors talk, the more I wanted to learn how to decrypt their sentences and to grasp the political backstory of the grave concerns that commanded their attention and aroused such fist-pounding dinner debate." So is this, like I said, is this why you come across as a young old man?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, when you grow up around university people, I think you absorb a certain way of talking and coming at the world. I remember believing as a kid, my parents both taught at the university, and I understood even from preschool, I think, it seemed to me there were two types of people, two types of grown-ups when I figured out who the parents of my friends were. There were the ones with jobs, and then there were the ones who did something at the university. And I took those to be very serious, right? Like my friend Ryan's dad managed a pizza place. Like I understood exactly what he did, right? And then my parents were at the university, whatever that was. And so there's this kind of mysterious world, and they're using these big words, and they're mentioning names, and it's very fierce. You know, they're talking about these people I've never heard of, and you can tell just how much passion exists around this idea versus that idea. And I think I took that on board before I understood what any of it meant. But then it meant a lot of light bulbs went off when I actually got, especially to college, and figured out what was behind all of this.
Right. You got to college, which was Harvard, where you graduated magna cum laude in 2004. BA in History and Literature, by the way. And then you went on to Oxford, Pembroke College. You graduated first in 2007, is that right?
Yeah, with a first. So it was a first-class honors. Yeah.
See, you can tell I haven't gone to Oxford.
But it's a scary thing. So everybody there, your degree is either a first, a second upper class, second lower, or third. That's their entire grading scale. And there's no private, like they stick it up on the wall. And you find out what everybody's grades were at the end of your time there. But yeah, I worked really hard for that. So
were you gunning for first, or were you just hoping to survive?
Early on, I was hoping to survive because what happened was, so Oxford has this famous program, PPE, right? It's philosophy, politics, and economics, and it used to be what most Americans did when they got there, if they got a scholarship like I did. Now it's less popular, I think, because it's so hard, and you could either do 2 out of the 3. So you could do philosophy and politics, you could do politics and economics, or you could try to do all 3. And I wanted to do all 3 because one of the things I wanted to learn was economics. I hadn't done it in college. But the college I was arriving at was really skeptical that I could hack it. So we cut this deal that if I could learn the first year's worth in the first 10 weeks, then they would allow me to become a second-year student. Because the scholarship money only covered 2 years, even though it was a 3-year program.
Wow.
So I showed up to my first tutorial in economics, and it's very Oxford. It's this one-on-one system, right? So you sit down, and I survived about 10 minutes before she kicked me out. Which is real. I mean, you show up, you're a Rhodes Scholar, you think you're very intelligent, right? It's pretty galling to be kicked out of class. But especially when you're the only person in the class. That means the professor thinks it's a better use of her time to tell you to go away and try again, right, than to try to explain it to you. So by the time, a year and a half later that I got to where I was pretty happy with that.
So, and I'm glad you mentioned this story about the professor, because maybe this explains something on page 57, which I wrote in my notes, Oxford precision. You write, after years of painting with broad verbal brushes, the kind of beautiful images that earn good grades in certain American college literature courses, I now had to make sure that every sentence and idea was precise, clearly defined, and airtight in order to survive the skepticism of a British critic.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. It's very prescient to where we are now. I mean, they get it. What do you mean, People, when they've seen you, when they've heard your interviews or the town halls, you are very precise in what you're saying. So this was good training, this Rhodes Scholarship of yours.
Yeah, it's great training. I mean, first of all, it sounds quaint these days, but I think it's important to tell the truth. And but it's actually hard to tell the truth. Even when you're trying, it's hard to get everything exactly right, especially, just think of the number of words that come out of your mouth in a given day, especially if you talk for a living, which is kind of what happens when you're a candidate. Just by the law of averages, if 1/2 of the things you say are a little bit off, you will say thousands of things that are untrue over the course of a month. And so you really want to make sure that everything you say is measured, or at least is right. And it's so easy. I remember one of the moments that taught me that at Oxford. I had a paper, and I was just saying things that you say. I was a paper on the Middle East, and I was writing about how, I don't know, something about how the colonial patterns helped explain all the, unstable borders that we'd seen in the Middle East over the years. It's one of these things that I could have gotten away with, I felt like, earlier on, but not there. So then I was challenged in this tutorial. I said, okay, which borders in the Middle East are unstable? I was like, well, think of everything that's going on. It was like, okay, which borders moved? And I was like, oh, okay. There are unstable countries, unstable politics, but actually since 1947, not many of the borders moved at all. There's just one of these little things, right, that a faculty member there was trained to find exploit, embarrass me over, and then train me never to make that mistake again. And I do think that having that built into the grooves of your brain probably serves you well when the things you say are, on television, and if it's wrong, somebody will notice and remind you.
Oh yeah, I know that feeling. How many more times were you kicked out of your one-person class?
So the
How many more times?
the next time I survived was an hour-long tutorial. I survived a half hour before she told me to leave, so I thought that was progress.
A half hour out of how many minutes you were supposed to be there?
Like out of an hour.
An hour,
I made it halfway through.
Right, okay.
The following week, I survived the hour. The fourth week was the first time that the words "well done" escaped her lips. But on their system, I think the whole term is only 8 or 10 weeks. So I didn't know, I was racing against time. But the point is I made it. I didn't, maybe didn't ace it, but I made it.
There was an interesting thing on page 10 that you wrote where you write about your youth, where you're like, I'm young enough that I don't always use a TV set to watch television, but old enough that you might catch me using the phrase flat screen TV as if they sell any other kind. And here's the really interesting sentence. Being in your 30s today means you have lived more or less half and half with Democratic and Republican presidencies, known 20 years of peace and 15 years of war. And in reading that, I wondered, given this view, do you view yourself as a generational bridge for the nation? There's a lot of talk about two septuagenarians who are in the race and who are leading the pack among the 23, and then a lot of talk about some of the younger people. Okay, you, the youngest person, the youngest person in the race, and
yeah.
What are you doing, and why are you
Right.
why are you in this race? But in reading that, it made me wonder, well, is America ready for someone to be this generational bridge between the quote-unquote old
Yeah.
and the quote-unquote new?
In a way, yeah. I think it's important, first of all, it's a very American thing, at least in certain seasons, and I think we're coming up on one, to empower a new generation. But I do think being a little bit on the elder side of that millennial category, the fact that, when my class arrived in college, everybody having cell phones, let alone smartphones, stuff like YouTube, social media, were not a thing. And by the time we left, all of those were a thing. Or at least by the time I was finished being a student. And so there's some sense of both of those worlds. If you think the defining thing of our generation is the digital experience, then there's having a little bit of a foot in both of those worlds. And one of the things we've seen on the campaign trail is how much a lot of the people who respond best to a more or less explicitly generational message are actually people from my parents' generation who are excited or compelled about the idea of passing the torch.
Glad you brought that up because, well, my mother's watching the live stream, and I've talked about this before. She's 77, obviously African American, born and raised in North Carolina, evangelical, born-again Christian. She kind of follows politics. If the name isn't Jones or Smith or something easy to pronounce, she's not there. However, on Easter, at Easter brunch, we're just sort of sitting around and talking, and when she's ready to talk politics, she just starts talking, and she says, "You know who I find interesting?" I said, "Who, Mom?" "Mayor Pete Buttigieg." I whipped around so hard. One, because wait, you pronounced his name correctly. How is that? And then I heard from another friend whose brother, coincidentally from North Carolina, African American in his 60s, who also evangelical, also likes likes you, finds you interesting. These are two older people. So maybe this is just ratification that you are this old man in a young man's body.
When I was running for mayor, we did a poll. We had enough money for one poll during that campaign. And we polled a lot of kind of basic attributes about me. And one of the things we were curious was what would people think of my age? Because I was 29 at the time. And
I heard giggles in the audience. And I'm like, don't you remember 29? Okay.
So if you knew that Pete was blank, was in the Navy, studied economics, was 29, would you be more or less likely to vote for him? And when the data came back, the older the voter was, the more likely they were to say me being 29 was a positive. That made them more inclined to vote for me. And we never got to the bottom of it. I don't know exactly what's behind all of that. It may be that I reminded some people of their kids. It may be that,
Or as we say in the black community, he reminds me of my grandbaby. Go on, I interrupted.
I mean, it may be that the older you are, the more you've seen people of all ages succeed and fail, and it's less of a factor for you. I don't know exactly what the reasoning was, but I think the same principle, I'm certainly thrilled with the support we get from students and very young people who come to our events, but there is something about that, especially at a moment like this, that I think is really interesting.
When you ran for mayor the first time, you write about the fact that you went on a listening tour. You went around and you talked to people just to hear them out. And among the people you talked to, you went to the African-American pastors on the west side of South Bend to hear them out. And I'm curious, what did you learn from them? What did you hear from them when you were exploring that run that first time?
Well, part of it was a sense of skepticism about anyone in politics serving their part of the community well. The west side had been historically underinvested. It had even as the economy started to come back in parts of the city, over there it was like the recovery had never happened for a lot of people. And I think they had seen enough political figures come and go that even more than most kind of hard-bitten South Bend residents, they really wanted some indication that I was serious. Another thing that was, I think, really important was they wanted me to understand how the black experience was different, specifically different in South Bend. And it was important for me to learn because I think that, you know, I'd thought a lot about, I don't think I ever bought into rising tide lifts all boats exactly. But I had been kind of taught, I don't know where I was taught this, but I guess I kind of absorbed maybe from my media diet, the idea that if you just paint broad strokes, everybody will find that if I talk about making the city better off, that'll touch everybody and everybody think they have a stake in that. And enough people had seen enough things happen in the city that left them out completely, that unless I was talking about what I was going to do for this neighborhood, or what I was going to do on this side of town, or what I was going to do on this particular issue affecting this particular slice of the community, that there was going to be a lot of skepticism that even if I succeeded in my stated aims, that it was really going to be worth them coming on board and supporting it.
And in that first election, you won election with 75% of the vote? 75% of the vote. Now, you write in the book, so now you've won, and you say to your campaign manager, Mike Schmuel, this is probably like the best day we're ever going to have.
Right.
And then in the book, you then write about what has become known as the tapes case. Right. And this is on page 274. You write, as the first African-American chief in our city's history, Darrell Boykins had been uniquely able to build confidence between communities of color and the department as a whole. I decided during the transition phase that I would reappoint him and save major police department reforms for a future year. It turned out to be my first serious mistake as mayor. And I read that line a few times to try to understand, wait, which was the serious mistake? Why was that, how did that, and why was that the first serious mistake as mayor?
The reason was that I recognized that there were a lot of issues in the police department that needed reform, but I felt that it would be so disruptive both to the department and to the community to tackle that right away that I just thought it could wait. And there were plenty of reasons, like the good track record of community policing, to help put a thumb on the scale on the other side, that I'm going to reappoint this, even though I feel like the condition of the department is a mixed bag, I'm going to reappoint its current leader. And if we're going to try to do something to modernize or professionalize the police department, we'll do it later. And I don't think I really appreciated just how urgent it was to tackle the issues in there. And so I learned the hard way. And it was a hard way to learn that there are some things you cannot defer, and there are some things you can't put off.
Well, you learned the hard way because the FBI came to you and said, we're investigating your police chief because he was allegedly illegally taping phone calls of fellow officers in the department. And you wrote at the time in the book, you said, as of this writing, I've not heard these tapes.
Right.
As of right now, have you heard these tapes?
Still haven't, yeah. So they're the subject of a lawsuit between the officers who were recorded on the tapes and the city council, our council, who are basically suing each other. We have, the city physically possesses them, but we're not part of, I mean, it's a crossfire of lawsuits. I could not have understood when this thing started just how complicated the legal situation around this would become. But the bottom line is, even now, I don't know what's on these recordings.
And what makes them so incendiary is that there are allegations that racial slurs were used among the police officers.
Exactly.
And you haven't heard them because it's illegal for you to hear it.
It may be.
It may be.
Right.
Maybe and not definitely?
That's what we're waiting for the court to tell us.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
But if it is, then it's a felony. So that's why we've got to get that.
And we have enough with chief executives, cloud felonies. You write later on page 277, for those of you following along in your books, the story dominated media coverage of my administration for most of our first year and affected my relationship with the African American community, in particular, for years to come. What were you hearing from the community after that all blew up? And what are you still hearing from them now?
Well, the first thing was release the tapes. Right, and the last thing I wanted to be seen was to be seen as the protector of these recordings that may or may not have something terrible on them that we may or may not ever be able to hear legally, and to be confronted with that much ambiguity with a community that has deep mistrust, not without reason. Right, this is one of the things I then got educated in as we went. I mean, it's one thing as a student to learn about, for example, all the ways in which so many of the worst moments of the struggle of the civil rights era boil down to interactions between black activists and law enforcement officers, right? And how the local instantiation of this national struggle was so often person of color versus police officer. It's one thing to kind of see that in the abstract. It's another to be responsible for the police department, also responsible for the community being viewed as, or feeling like it's one. In a diverse community with a 25% African American population, as a white mayor, figuring out what it means to try to heal these wounds that I own, right? Because I own everything in the city, but especially anything related to the city administration, including the police department. What I learned was just how much pain was behind that relationship. And at the same time, what I also learned was just how many things could be done, even while I was in a bind with regards to this issue of these recordings, to make a difference. And so I believe I know I would have been inclined to do these things anyway, but the urgency around establishing bias training and civil rights training for our department, the urgency around getting body cameras implemented, the urgency around establishing what I think is one of the most transparent online presences of a police department, at least of our size, in the region and perhaps in the country, even publishing use of force incident data. The urgency of establishing and maintaining an African American majority on the Board of Public Safety, which is a body of 5 civilians that I appoint who have the final say on police discipline. I think I learned the hard way just how important it would be to do those. But the good news was, by the end of my first term, even people in the community who may never think that my specific sequence of choices in handling the whole police affair my first year was what they would have done or was the right thing, that in the end they understood my intention, they understood the trajectory of the city, and they were prepared to support me at the polls.
So now you're running for president, and you're running in a party where the granite base of the party is the African American vote, African American women in particular. South Carolina is the 3rd state in the primary contest, primarily because the African American electorate is paramount in South Carolina. And there was a poll that came out, I believe it was last week, where you are polling at 0%. Among African Americans. How are you going to bring the message of what you've done in South Bend and what seems to be good relationships with the African American community in your hometown to the people in South Carolina and the black voter-rich Super Tuesday states that are coming in rapid succession?
Right, so this is vital, first of all, in order for us to win, but also in order for us to deserve to win, that we have a coalition and supporters that are as diverse as our party. And not just our party in general, but my generation in our party is still more diverse, the most diverse ever. What we're finding with a lot of these early state voters is the challenge is not that they've sized me up and they don't like me, it's that they don't know me. They don't feel that they know me at all. And so what we're seeing is that there are people who will find their way to my events wherever I am, and then there are people who will never hear our message unless we find creative ways of getting to them. And while I had 4 years to build that trust in South Bend, I have a matter of months to do it in the primary process. And so part of our approach is to make sure we're building out a team on our campaign side that reflects the diversity of the coalition we want to build. A lot of it is engagement, not just in the public events, but kind of when the cameras are off, having small, quiet engagements with activists, with faith leaders, with people connected to HBCUs, with anybody we can find to not only obviously make sure they understand the message of the campaign, which people, I believe, are responding to very well, but also to invite them to shape the campaign in many ways, to ask them to help us think about the right vocabularies, the right ways that we can be a voice for them in this process. And I'm very confident that as we do that, we will continue to see our support grow. But there is a huge challenge for any candidate who is, A, not themselves a candidate of color, and B, not somebody who's been known for years or maybe decades, to earn in very short order the confidence of black voters in the South.
You mentioned how you've been trying to figure out novel ways to bring your message to people or constituencies who wouldn't normally hear you. And one of those things you did was on May 19th with that Fox News town hall. Yeah. My Twitter feed has been on fire because of the piece I wrote saying that you did a couple of things in that Fox News town hall that, to my mind, made it worth it going on Fox News to talk about your candidacy. What do you say to those people burning up my Twitter feed? And I'm sure there might be quite a few people in this audience who don't understand why on earth would you, from their perspective, waste your time going to a channel that does what it does for an audience that's not going to vote for you anyway.
So the first thing to remember is just how many people tune into this network. And while there's no question that a lot of what is said on that network is in bad faith, especially among the opinion hosts, there are a lot of people who are viewing it in good faith. And we act surprised when people believe absurd things or endorse horrible positions or candidates. But we sometimes forget, I think, that if you're in a media ecosystem where that's all you get, that people will never really be confronted with our message at all. It's not like I think by spending one night on Fox News, I'm going to convert their viewership. Although I do think their viewership needed to hear specifically what I think of some of their opinion hosts, and so I said it.
Right.
And then some of our friends on Twitter saw, people like Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham and Sean Hannity losing their damn minds the next day on the air, right? And they're like, see, this is proof that it was folly to go on there. It's like, I didn't go on there because I thought they would suddenly like me. I went on there because there are a lot of people who tune in casually, who may literally never even hear our message. And I also wanted to model, frankly, for my own party, the extent to which we can go into audiences where there's a lot of conservatives and a lot of independents and reach them and speak to them, not by becoming more conservative. That's the 90s formula for reaching independents. Not by pretending to be more conservative than we are, which is just tricking people, and that'll catch up to you. But just by making sure we have the right kind of vocabulary to talk about progressive values. And it's not that we're going to win over a majority of those folks, but I always think of the counties in Indiana. We've got 92 of them. And I think of the conservative counties where it matters that you go there and campaign there and you will, when you lose that county, which you will if you're a Democrat, that it be 60-40 instead of 80-20. Because if you do that across 60 counties, then the swing counties and the blue counties can put you over the top. That's part of how Joe Donnelly became a U.S. Senator. It's not just about thinking naively that we can win everybody over. It's by taking the people who hate you and moving them to just kind of mildly disliking you. Taking the people who mildly dislike you and getting them to be neutral, and then getting some of those neutral people to actually be for you.
Mm-hmm. So I asked a conservative friend of mine, who definitely is not going to vote for President Trump, a question. Gave an opportunity, give me a question to ask Mayor Pete.
Oh.
And here's what he said. I'd be curious to hear his answer to why a moderate pro-life conservative who despises Trump should vote for him.
Well.
We don't have that much time.
First of all, if you despise Trump and you'd like the opposite of what we have now in the White House, it doesn't get much more opposite of this president than a guy like this. Secondly, it's that while we won't have the same values on everything, no two people ever will, but at least I can show you that I'm motivated by values and that the positions I've arrived at are ones I will come by honestly. And the third is that I am seeking to deliver results that anybody, especially a moderate conservative, should be able to embrace. We're not going to come to the same place on the choice issue. We're just not. But if by chance your view on that issue is motivated by your faith, I would point out that this is also a moment for people of faith to think about what it means to support policies and politicians who care about lifting up the least among us and healing the sick and looking after the poor and taking responsibility for the downtrodden and humility and decency and all of the things we're taught in faith not reflected in this way.
Since you brought up faith, it's important to point out, for those who don't already know, faith is very important to you. Mm-hmm. Religion is very important to you. And there are many people, probably, especially possibly in this audience, who cringe when they hear politicians, and maybe especially Democratic politicians, talk about faith and their beliefs. You talk about how your faith, as you just did, guides you. And as I think people heard, and that's why they applauded, you talk about it very authentically. How are you going to continue talking about it so you don't turn off a big part of the Democratic Party and bring them to respect and support you in these efforts, to get them to understand how important it is for you to have a faith strategy?
Well, I think the Democratic political allergy to talking about faith comes from a very good place. It comes from our commitment to the separation of church and state. And our awareness that anybody in politics, and certainly anybody in office, needs to be accountable to people of any religion and people of no religion equally. So we need to establish that we all agree on that. And at the same time, talk about, and by the way, another reason that a lot of people who are part of the Democratic coalition have trouble with faith is they feel that a lot of faith institutions have been hostile to them. But this is also an opportunity to point to all of the ways in which faith can lead you somewhere besides the arms of the religious right. At a moment when we have a president who is inimical not only to our values, but to theirs, if we think about what he stands for or how he acts, relative to how even the self-professed views of evangelical conservatives run. It's all the more opportunity to remind ourselves of how, for example, the religious left, which isn't talked about as much, without the religious left, there's probably not a civil rights movement as we know it, just to take one example. And you don't have to identify with it to make common cause with people who are motivated for religious reasons as well as for reasons that have nothing to do with faith, to make ourselves part of this bigger push. And at a moment when solidarity is so hard to come by in this country, I think it's a really good moment for secular and religious people who believe in a more inclusive and decent future to band together.
So the Democratic Party is not at war with itself, but having a very stern conversation with itself about whether the president should be impeached. An hour or so ago, I just flipping through Twitter and saw that Senator Elizabeth Warren, one of the 23, sent out a tweet asking people to sign a pledge, and the pledge is entitled, "Congress should begin impeachment proceedings against Donald Trump." So my question to you is, would you sign that petition?
I'd like to read it, but
that's it.
That's it?
That's it. Congress should begin impeachment proceedings against Donald Trump. Please sign. Would you sign that?
Yeah, I'm open to that. Look, it's...
Wait, don't fall for that. Wait, you're open to it, or you would sign it? It's here, sign.
So I usually don't make signing decisions on stages, but look,
Should he be impeached?
Of course, he deserves it. Of course he deserves it. And the real question I think we need to ask ourselves is, okay, first of all, as we see these outrages against the rule of law, rejecting lawful subpoenas, telling private citizens to reject legitimate inquiries from Congress, thumbing his nose in so many different ways at not only the opposition, but at the Constitution. At what point can that only be met with the response of impeachment? We also need to ask ourselves, okay, what are we trying to achieve? And part of what you can achieve is simply to draw a line about what is right and what is wrong, and the House Democrats can do that. If they do that, it then goes to the Republican Senate, where there are a lot of people acting in bad faith who obviously are unlikely to do the right thing when it comes to this president. And so, independent of what's going on in Congress, what's on my mind is, first of all, since I'm not in Congress, the best thing I can do about this president is defeat him. But also, we got to remember, this president and the phenomena that he unleashed will last much longer than the presidency itself does. And one of the most important questions is, what, if any, reckoning will happen among the Republicans over their complicity with this? And will they, even though I'll never agree with the Republican Party, it's actually important that there be one that is at least minimally coherent. If only to illuminate some good faith disagreements, right? Now, I believe the only way that they will get in touch with their consciences is if they witness terrible political consequences for this president. And the best way we can bring, or at least the best way I can concretely contribute to bringing that about, is to see to it that there is a massive electoral thumping for this president in 2020 at the ballot box.
So those Democrats who are calling for Congress to start impeachment proceedings right now, today, that's a mistake?
No, I don't think it's a mistake. I just am trying to, look, obviously there's a lot of theatrics in politics, right?
Yeah.
And, a mayor telling the Congress what to do in an investigative proceeding is perhaps a legitimate act of political theater that would send a message about why the president's impeachment would be a good response to his thumbing his nose at the rule of law. But I'm also very mindful that my role is to beat him. My role is to get the nomination, and then because I'm not like the others and because I'm not like him, to deliver on the chance to change completely the course of this country. And so, we'll continue to look at the right way to draw a line, but I also hope that we do it with smart expectations about what effect it's going to have.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's fast forward. You're president of the United States. We're not even in transition. You are president of the United States. And this question comes from a national security friend of mine.
Yeah.
Who wanted to know, do you commit to hold accountable former members of the Trump administration who are subsequently found to have committed crimes during their time in government, or Do you believe removal from office is punishment enough?
No, I think if you committed a crime, you should be criminally liable for what you did.
And the reason why I ask that question is, like, we've been down this road before. How many of you are still upset that no one was held legally accountable for what happened, the financial implosion in 2008?
Right.
So to hear you say that, that's why you're getting that applause. Before we went out, there was news coming out from the Associated Press that a plan is being sent to the White House to send 10,000 troops to the Middle East as a means of preparing for whatever might happen with Iran. As a combat veteran, I would love to get your view, and also think of this as a foreign policy question. Is it the right thing to do to be saber-rattling against Iran, to be planning to send 10,000 troops, to be sending 10,000 troops to the Middle East for a third conflict?
No. Look, first of all, the fact that an architect of the Iraq War, John Bolton, is even allowed in the Situation Room by a president who claims, falsely of course, that he was against the Iraq War all along. And remember, I'm old enough to remember in 2002, a lot of Democrats lying and saying that they were for the Iraq War even though deep down they knew better because they thought that was required of them politically.
That's some strong stuff to say they were lying.
Or at the very least, well, no, I think that was true. I think at least some of I'll never know who's who or which was which, but it cannot be that every Democrat who talked themselves into being for that war really thought it was a good idea. And 14 short years later, we got Republicans lying and pretending they were against it all along. And the reason for that, of course, is that we now know what a disaster it was. Now, as I write in the book, I think it would have been no less of a disaster if there actually had been weapons of mass destruction, because he would have used them on us, and we wouldn't have had to be there in the first place to create the situation where he would have used them. But the point is, the next president's got to establish a higher bar for what it will take to deploy military force. And I say this, first of all, as somebody who knows what it means to pack your bags and be deployed on the orders of a U.S. president, and to write a letter and put it where your family can find it. And to know that right now, someone in Afghanistan is doing the same thing that I was doing. And I thought I was one of the last people turning out the lights 5 years ago. But more than that, some other person is in uniform in East Africa right now, based on the same congressional act that authorized the Afghanistan war after 9/11. I mean, that's how loose we've gotten with authorizations for what is amounted to a forever war. And to see some of the same people that got us into Iraq now trying to get us, apparently, to escalate us to Iran, and the very real possibility, given the dysfunction of this administration, that this is a situation that the president himself does not fully control, or that could get to where the president cannot control it, is terrifying, especially when you consider the fact that this White House and this administration has not hesitated to use troops as props. We saw it in the border. We saw the saber rattling around Venezuela. I mean, it's awful over there, but the same guy, by the way, John Bolton, right, using a notepad to kind of casually hint that we might send troops there. And when you were an officer responsible for enlisted people, or even just when you see, we just had a ceremony in South Bend to honor high school students who were getting ready to serve. And you look them in the eye and you think that, look, they don't necessarily enlist saying, I hope I never get deployed. That's not what, sometimes there's this idea that deployments by their nature make victims of members of the military. It's not that. You join and you're ready to deploy if necessary. That's the whole idea of getting in, is that you're there if America needs you. But America better not call you to do that if it's not necessary, because it is not a show and it's not a game.
But does that mean, So then, when should the United States send troops overseas? Is it, I mean, obviously it's when our national security
It's when there's
when
there's a core life or death interest in the homeland where our security is at stake, or when it is a legitimate part of an international action, when, for example, an ally is attacked. And in both of those cases, even then, when there is no alternative.
And so when an ally is attacked, and this is a different kind of warfare, I'm talking about Russia, which has been attacking our allies electorally in the same way that they did to our 2016 election, which you have a lot of people saying we have to reimagine warfare, that we were attacked, that what happened in our election in 2016 was an act of war. So how would you, as president, respond to an act of war from Russia?
Well, what they did was to attack the fundamental thing that keeps us safe, which is our democracy. Because it is your vote, not your gun, it is your vote that ensures that your government works for you and not the other way around. And that's what they attacked. Now, we have a range of tools, short of military action. We have a range of tools to deal with security threats and diplomatic needs. Diplomatic tools, economic tools, cyber tools. And I think that if the president is serious about deterring the next attack, the president will be ready to use those tools, perhaps in overt ways and perhaps in covert ways, to make sure that it never happens again. So this is not a matter of lashing out with an ill-considered use of force, but this is a matter of a proportional response that will make it in Russia's interest never to do something like that again.
And with Afghanistan, are you for, especially having been there, are you for withdrawal or keep the same level of troops, or does the country need another surge to reestablish security to previous levels since loss?
We cannot be the guarantors of peace and security in Afghanistan. Our only function there should be to make sure that there's not an attack on the homeland, and we don't need an indefinite presence of ground troops in order to do it. Look, we're getting out. The only real question is, how are we getting out? And the way we're getting out, the way we might be getting out right now, is a bit of a concern because it seems to be sidelining the Afghan government while we're having these talks with the Taliban. But it is in everybody's interest. This is the one thing that the Taliban, the Afghan government, the coalition, and the American left and the American right finally agree on, is that we got to go. And so, again, the alarming thing is that even as we're finally figuring out how to get out of there, there's talk of us going right back into another country in the region.
I have to ask you about China and the trade war and the tariffs, and how much sense does it make that the United States is in a tariff battle with a nation that owns most of its debt?
Roughly zero cents. Now, let me say this. The China challenge is real. So not everybody in my party sees it this way, but I think it would be a mistake to suppose that we can continue down the policy path of saying the only thing that matters in our China relationship is to keep it stable. Because China has changed its strategy. They used to famously be in hide and bide mode, right? Lay low, bide their time. And now I think they are acting proactively and strategically to take advantage of perceived weaknesses in the American system, really ever since the financial crisis, but especially now that we have this political chaos. And that challenge is very real, especially now at this moment when the Chinese model is being held up as an alternative to ours, because ours looks so chaotic and vulnerable. And yet, if you look at what's happening there, what you see is some very impressive economic growth, a lot of technological development, and then the use of that technological development for the perfection of dictatorship, which makes this actually a moment more than ever when American leadership on the world stage, and I mean American leadership in the old, almost romanticized sense of moral authority, even though our moral authority has always been mixed. It is needed more than ever. But this strategy, if it's not even a strategy, this pattern of poking him in the eye to see what will happen is not going to get us there. Slapping tariffs, which by the way are taxes on Americans, slapping tariffs on goods is not going to get them to change their economic model. If we really want to compete with China, we got to do two things. One is to invest in our own domestic competitiveness, like technology, education, infrastructure, and health, so that we're more competitive to begin with. The second is to try to make sure that the competition is actually taking place on good terms, terms that are favorable to us. Terms, for example, like having it still matter in geopolitics that you support and respect democracy and human rights. Or maybe something like climate diplomacy, where a country is powerful or prestigious in proportion to how good of a job it's doing leading globally on climate. Those would be terms that would be favorable to the U.S. if we were putting our money where our mouth is and actually had a pretty good handle on prioritizing democracy and climate action here at home. But until we do that, it's going to be hard to lead in the rest of the world.
And, you know, I'm glad you brought up climate because, you know, climate, the environment, water, which brings me to Flint. And I'm wondering, and I'm trying to find this question that I got from Mitchell Gold, who, the furniture Mitchell Gold and Bob Williams, who from North Carolina, he's very interested in the environment, and he's also very concerned about clean water. And he wanted me to ask you about what is your plan. Because there was just a story in the Washington Post just the other day about Flint still doesn't have clean water. People are still drinking and using poisoned water. You're president of the United States. What's your plan to finally get Flint clean water?
Well, clean water is a right. Let's start by establishing that. And from a perspective of justice, as well as from a perspective of basic human development, it's unacceptable that Americans in 2019 are unable to get a glass of clean, safe drinking water out of the tap. Now, this happens to be something that every mayor thinks about a lot, because when you're a mayor, you're in the business of getting everybody clean water. It's what probably my most fundamental responsibility to the people of South Bend. And there's obviously a long and ugly story, largely involving the relationship with the state of how Flint got to where it is. But the bottom line is that there needs to be some federal backstop to the quality of infrastructure. When we hear infrastructure, we think a lot, and especially, you know, we usually think about transportation. We think about the sexy stuff, the bullet trains and airports, and I want all of that too. But the most important infrastructure we have is underground. It's water and wastewater. It's this unsexy stuff on which modern civilization depends. And if there's ever a circumstance, which there never should be, where a state or a city allows that to fail, there has to be a federal backstop to provide the means to correct it right away. If we can get clean water to a base in Afghanistan, then we can get it to Flint if it's a priority.
So I want to get your reaction to a certain Time magazine cover that hopefully can go up there. First family. Your husband Chasten sent out a tweet talking about 10 years ago. He was, I don't know if he mentioned the moment where he was homeless, and then he talked about when you were married, and then today you're on the cover of Time magazine with First Family. He's talked about how that's made him feel. How does it make you feel to be on the cover of a national magazine, and just by being on the cover of a national magazine, being held out as a model?
It's mind-blowing. I mean, when I was a student, I had some aspirations about public service, but it seemed to me then that there was going to be a fork in the road. That either I could be out or I could be in public service. That was true by law in the military, and it was true by unwritten law in politics, at least where I grew up in Indiana. It was as sure a fact as anything. And I have to admit, I probably thought that fact would live as long as I did. So the fact that I find myself on the cover of a magazine, not by suppressing who I am, but by being who I am, is frankly one of the things that gives me the hope that is required to run for office at a time like this. Because without hope, you can't run for office.
And was it in response to this? Was it in response to the magazine cover that I believe was it Franklin Graham, who said that being gay is, quote, something to be repentant of, not something to be flaunted, praised, or politicized? What would you say to the Franklin Grahams of the world, the Mike Pences of the world, who have an issue with the LGBTQ community?
I guess I would say that we all have a lot to repent for. I have a lot to repent for when it comes to my marriage. Moments when I've not been as caring as I should be. Moments when I've been selfish. Moments when I've said a harsh word that I wish I could take back. But one thing that I absolutely should not be repentant for in the context of my marriage is the fact that I'm in love with my husband.
And in fact, your husband Chasten said on CBS Sunday Morning, which if folks haven't seen it, it's all online. It's like 11 minutes of just Chasten talking. I was wondering, when is Mayor Pete going to talk? But Chasten is there, and Chasten is as impressive as you are when it comes to just speaking from the heart. And he said, when asked by John Dickerson about people questioning, your marriage and things, and he wrote, I think I don't have to answer for it. We passed marriage equality. I don't think I have to answer for my marriage anymore. In the little bit of time that we have left, I do want to ask you this one question. I have two more. A friend of mine wrote an op-ed, openly gay, executive vice president at the Roosevelt Institute. And he wrote, I'm going to try to keep this short, 10-year-old me certainly didn't think that an openly gay man or woman would ever become president or even have a fighting chance at it. Even a year or two ago, I didn't think it was something I'd see in my lifetime. The reception Buttigieg has received is nothing short of a miracle. I'm glad that his sexual orientation is seen as an asset, but my happiness isn't so great that my inner skeptic isn't wondering if part of the reason why Buttigieg is so popular right now is because he's the kind of gay person many, and maybe even most Americans can feel safe, even proud of themselves for liking. He fits the mold of someone who is not just right for the political moment, but who is traditionally and narrowly respectable and therefore deserving of support. I'm also not naive enough to think that a gay man who is not white or a transgender person of any sexual orientation or race would be receiving the same amount of support that Buttigieg is, or that they'd have the same pathways to success available to them that he has had as a well-educated white man in America, and that's regardless of his innate talents, which I believe are impressive and rare. If I were that 10-year-old gay boy today watching an openly gay man being taken seriously by the public and the press as he runs for the presidency, I'd want someone to tell me that I don't have to be exceptionally talented or seemingly superhuman to merit equal rights or to be treated with respect and dignity, that I had values simply for who I was, and I should never feel like conformity was the necessary path to happiness, acceptance, and success. This is coming from a very personal and deep place for him. What is your reaction to that?
We could have a whole hour on that. I mean,
and we
first
don't.
of all, there's a lot of questions about the relationship of conformity to nonconformity. There's questions about privilege in there. I don't know what it would be like, frankly. if I were different in any number of ways, from the way I present relative to other gay people to my race or gender. What I hope, though, is that I guess I hope for what everybody hopes for, which is just to be accepted for what I am. And I hope for that for everybody too, everybody else. And that can be twice as hard or 10 times as hard, depending on who you are and how that's freighted. And it changes over time. The way any given category of people changes over time. It's one of the reasons why no matter what categories you do or don't belong to, in this season we've all got to stick together. You know, I was earlier today we did an event in Queens and was looking at kind of the demographics of the era we were in, and a lot of different backgrounds and a lot of people of color, a lot of people also who are Irish and Italian. And I was thinking about how there was a time when being Irish or Italian, frankly, was not the same as being white. And so at a moment like this, when every possible reason for excluding somebody has been weaponized by this administration, it's a reason we've all got to be ready to stand up for each other, not by pretending that we know what it's like to be in somebody else's shoes. I don't know beans about what it's like to be, even within the LGBT community. I don't know what it's like to be trans. I just know enough to know I got to stand up for somebody who is. I know that if she's a trans woman of color, it is 10 times harder to be her. I know that one of the reasons yesterday I was at the Supreme Court is that I know that because I'm a man, it is even more important for me to be standing with women while their rights are under attack. All of us have to figure out how to find what's in our identity and use it as a source of solidarity for others, because anybody can be marginalized, and so many people right now are, that if we don't stick together, you never know who's going to be next.
Last question. Secretary Castro was mayor of San Antonio, and that is an $18.2 million budget. Mayor de Blasio of New York City is running for president, and population 8.6 million with a budget of $92.5 billion. San Antonio has 1.4 million. And South Bend, with a population of 102,000 and a budget of, if I got this right, $336 million.
Give or take.
The question from Sue is, why do you think that being the mayor of a mid-sized city is adequate preparation to be president of the United States?
All right. So, first of all, I get the audacity of somebody like me proposing to run for president. I would also argue that there is something audacious to the point of obscenity about any mortal thinking they belong in that office. Because the only honest answer is nothing is adequate preparation to be president of the United States. But the 45 people we've sent in there have all had in common, some being better than others, the fact that they were all mortals and they all had some set of experiences. And I do believe that the kinds of experience you have as a mayor of a city of any size, but perhaps also the kinds of experiences you have as a mayor in this moment in the industrial Midwest, who has lived and breathed the experience of a community that has that quality of being a place where people grow up being told that success means getting out, but knowing that there's an alternative to resentment as a way of engaging people in a community like that, and then having lived it and having had a chance to hold my hometown is proof that you don't get an honest or constructive politics out of the word again the way you do out of the word what's next. And when you are a mayor, you find yourself confronted with issues from economic development puzzles and negotiations to sometimes something right out of Parks and Recreation.
There was a question about that in here, but keep going.
I mean, we've got a duck pond issue right now that is really hot topic if you're in South Bend. There's a golf course that's basically my Vietnam. And just when you're having a good laugh about that's when you find out that there's been a racially explosive officer-involved shooting, and you got a matter of minutes to figure out in your head what you're going to say on TV that's going to knit people together when they're being pulled apart, and you don't even have the facts. You learn to manage things you don't control, how to control things you don't own, and that experience may not be the same as being president, but I gotta believe it's as good an experience as you can get to understand what it means to be leading in government.
And I want to throw up one last tweet from Chasten Buttigieg from May 7th, and this is perfect for where we are right now, and it's coming up, I swear. Basically, it's this panda. If downtime was a ball and politics were a panda. And with that, Mayor Pete Buttigieg of South Bend, Indiana, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.